She was 21 years old, and by the time Jerome Mack had finished explaining the terms of her severance, she had been reduced, cleanly, efficiently, with no raised voices and no unnecessary drama, to a line on a ledger that no longer needed balancing. Settle in with us for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This is the story of Opal Denning. Opal Denning had grown up in the sound of a press, not the sound most people associate with printing, the great mechanical thunder of a big city daily, but the quieter, more deliberate rhythm of a small job shop. The soft clank of type being set in the composing stick, the firm roll of the ink brayer, the precise lever pull of a platen press doing its patient work. She had grown up with that sound, the way other children grow up with birdsong or the creak behind the house. It was the sound that meant safety and order, and someone who knew what they were doing. That someone was Vincent Mack. He was 63 when she came to work in his shop, and she was 13 years old and newly orphaned, carrying a carpet bag. A silence so complete it unnerved the people who tried to speak kindly to her. Vincent Mack had not tried to speak kindly to her. He had shown her the composing stone, handed her a stick, poured a measure of type from the California job case, and said, "Set me a line of 12-point Caslon, 1 indent, 14 picas wide." She had looked at him. He had looked back. She set the line. It was crooked, the spacing uneven, a letter kern broken. He pulled it apart without comment and told her to set it again. She set it again, and again, and again, until the line sat clean and true in the stick, every letter properly spaced, the whole thing locked tight as a good argument. "Right," Vincent had said. "You'll do." She had lived above the shop for 8 years. She had learned typesetting, press make ready, paper estimation, ink mixings, proofreading, the pricing of job work, and the careful management of a small business that operated on thin margins and goodwill. Vincent was not a warm man in the conventional sense. He didn't ruffle hair or offer unprompted praise, but he was completely and utterly fair, which Opal had come to understand, by the time she was 18, was a rarer quality than warmth by a considerable distance. He had made her 2 promises. The first was the composing stick, his original one, a fine brass and steel tool he'd carried from his apprenticeship in Hamilton, worn to a perfect smoothness in the groove of his palm. He said she'd earned it the day she set her first full-page proof without a single transposition error. He placed it across the composing stone like it was a ceremony, and then went back to feeding the press, and that was the end of the ceremony. The second promise was the shop itself, in time. He had no children. The shop was his life's work. He had told her once on a winter afternoon when the print run was done, and they were cleaning type together, that he could think of no better use for the place than to leave it to someone who understood what it was for. He died on a Tuesday in March, a stroke found by Opal at the press where he had been setting a job for the Women's Institute. He had been midline. The composing stick was still in his hand. 3 weeks later, his nephew arrived from Toronto. Jerome Mack was a man of 35 with a good suit and a leather briefcase, and he had, as far as Opal could determine, met Vincent Mack perhaps twice in his adult life. He was not cruel. He was something that, in her experience, could do more damage than cruelty. He was entirely uninterested. He moved through the shop tapping surfaces, consulting papers, and had a buyer arranged from Peterborough by telegram before the week was out. He called Opal into the back office on a Friday. The ledger was open on the desk. She knew what was coming. She had watched Jerome Mack for 2 weeks, with the careful attention of someone who has learned early that people with authority over your life do not always announce their intentions in advance, and it is better to see clearly than to be surprised. He explained, without preamble, that the shop and all its equipment had been sold. The buyer would take possession the following Thursday. He had calculated her fair settlement. He showed her the ledger. He had tallied her wages for the past 3 years, at the minimum of what was customary, and then subtracted her lodging above the shop, a room barely large enough for a cot and a clothes press, at a figure that was, in Opal's private assessment, roughly double what such a room was worth anywhere in Haliburton County. The resulting sum was $73. He pushed the envelope across the desk. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. He met her gaze with the polite blankness of a man who had done nothing he considered wrong. She had spent 8 years learning from a man who believed that precision was a form of care, that every word set crooked was a thought half finished. Jerome Mack was the other kind of man, the kind who could perform the motions of fairness without any of its content and never once noticed the difference. There was nothing to say to that. She had no leverage, and she knew it. To argue would have been to spend her own dignity on a man who would not recognize the currency. She picked up the envelope. She asked, without heat, whether the composing stick had been itemized in the sale. Jerome glanced at his list. The old brass stick? Doesn't appear to be. You can have it. Thank you, she said, and left the office. She spent Wednesday evening alone in the shop after Jerome had gone back to his hotel. She ran her hand along the press frame, cold iron, solid and honest in the dark. She set one last line of type, a full sentence of 12-point Caslon that she locked up and proofed, and then immediately distributed back into the case, because it was not hers to keep. She turned off the lamp. She left at first light on Thursday. She had counted her money the night before and planned carefully. She bought a proper breakfast at the station house restaurant. Eggs, toast, strong tea, and filled her canvas bag for the road. A good loaf of bread, salt pork wrapped in paper, hard cheese, a jar of damson preserves. She was not going to arrive anywhere with an empty stomach and no options. Her father's people had made that mistake. She had watched it closely enough to know exactly what it cost. The land registry office in Dunmore Station smelled of damp paper and pipe tobacco. The clerk behind the counter was not unfriendly, exactly, but he had the settled contentment of a man who had never been in a hurry and saw no reason to start. Opal did not place her money on his counter. She asked, instead, what parcels he had available under $50 and what each one included. The clerk produced a ledger of his own. Most of what remained was rock and muskeg, barely suitable for gardening, let alone farming. There was one parcel along the old Spur lumber line, the station agent's building, plus a small outbuilding, 40 acres of mixed bush, recorded under the estate of a W.H. Pennock, who had died intestate in 1889. No claimants had come forward. It was listed at $72. She told him the outbuilding was listed as deteriorated on the survey notes, and the station house roof showed deflection in the northeast corner. She had seen the notation over his shoulder while he found the file. She offered $65 large flat, filing fees included. He looked at her. He looked at the notes. The parcel had been sitting unclaimed for 5 years. He agreed. She walked out of the registry office with $8 in her pocket and a deed to Lot 9, Pennock Spur subdivision. Her feet were steady on the board sidewalk. Her hands were not quite steady, which she kept to herself. She arranged a partial wagon lift with a freighter named Cormac Flett, a broad-shouldered man of 50 or so, who ran the smithy on the far end of town and hauled goods to the outlying properties on Wednesdays as a secondary enterprise. He looked at the deed without comment, then looked at her. Pennock's old station house, he said. Mill's been shut 12 years. Roof might have caved. I'll see what's there, she said. He drove her as far as the Spur Junction, 2 hours east of town, and left her with her bag at the point where the old railbed diverged from the county road. She paid him $3 and thanked him. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and turned his team back toward Dunmore Station. The railbed was overgrown, the iron rails half buried under 12 years of leaf mold and birch root, but they were still there, 2 parallel lines of rust running east into the shield country. The birch trees had grown up between the ties and their leaves, yellow in the late October air, came down in slow spirals around her as she walked. The sky above the tree line was that particular shade of deep October blue that only comes to the north when the summer has finally finished its argument. About 2 miles from the junction, a dog appeared at the edge of the tree line. It was a small, angular thing, black and white, one ear flopped and one ear up, its coat rough from a summer of fending for itself. It stopped at the edge of the railbed and looked at her with the calculating directness of an animal that has learned to take the careful measure of strangers. Opal stopped walking. She cut a piece of hard cheese from her supply and placed it on the nearest rail without looking at the dog directly. She started walking again. By the time she had gone 50 yards, the dog was at her heel. The station house was not as bad as she had feared, which was a relative statement. The northeast corner of the roof had deflected, and 2 courses of cedar shingles had come away, but the structure beneath was sound enough. Old-growth cedar board and batten, the kind that takes its time rotting. Both windows were intact. The wood stove in the main room was firm on its legs, and its chimney, when she looked up through it at the October sky, showed only a small bird's nest wedged at the elbow joint. The outbuilding was lower, built of squared logs, its chinking largely fallen away. She pushed the door open. She saw the tarpaulin first. Canvas, much faded, draped over something table height in the far corner. She crossed the dirt floor and pulled it back. a printing press. Not a big iron floor press, but a Chandler and Price tabletop platen model, hand-operated, the style a single printer could run without a power source. The ink rollers had gone hard and cracked with age, and the ink disc was gummed solid with old ink dried to the color of old blood. But the cast iron frame was untouched by rust, and when she worked the operating lever by hand, the platen opened and closed with only a small complaint from the joints. Her hands knew what it was before her mind had quite finished processing what she was seeing. She stood in the cold November light of the outbuilding for a long moment, looking at the press. The dog sat in the doorway and watched her. Beside the press stood a type cabinet, a low chest of shallow drawers for holding lead type. She pulled the first drawer, empty, the type distributed or stolen long ago. The second drawer, the same scattered pieces only. She pulled the third. It stuck. She worked it with both hands, rocking it gently in its runners, until it came free with a grinding complaint. Inside, a few pieces of old type, a bent rule, a scattering of wooden furniture blocks. And the bottom of the drawer was not the bottom of the drawer. It was a fitted panel of thin poplar, beveled to sit flush, so close to the true bottom that she would have closed the drawer and missed it entirely if the grain of the wood hadn't run crosswise, betraying itself to someone who had spent years learning how wood behaves. She used the tang of her composing stick to work the panel at its edge. It lifted. Beneath it, in an oilcloth parcel tied with printer's twine and sealed along every seam with a careful bead of wax, lay something that had been placed with the deliberate care of someone who did not intend to leave things to chance. She untied the twine, she broke the wax, she unfolded the oilcloth. Dominion of Canada banknotes, a small cloth bag of coins, and an envelope. She counted the money with methodical care, her hands steady now by an act of will. $340 in total. In 1894, that was enough to rebuild a roof, purchase type and paper in quantity, and still carry a working reserve into the new year. She set the money aside and opened the envelope. The handwriting inside was small and very regular, the hand of someone who had spent a long time setting type and could not stop thinking in straight lines even when holding a pen. My name is Millicent Vore. My husband Aldous operated this press for the Pennock Mill from 1871 until the mill closed in 1882. When he died, I continued using the press on my own for the families living further up the Tote Road. Printing notices, letters to the county seat, records that these families needed kept but had no way of producing themselves. I did this work for 9 years. My hands have become unreliable, and I am going to live with my daughter in Kingston. I do not expect to return. I am leaving the money and the press here together because they belong together. The money is what I saved from printing work during those years. I lived simply and kept what I didn't spend, thinking it would be useful to someone who came next. I could not move the press alone, and I could not bear to see it broken for scrap. If you are reading this, you came down the Pennock Spur when the world told you it ran to nothing worth finding. I think that says something about the kind of person you are. The press will run again if you clean the ink disc with linseed oil and replace the composition rollers. There is a blacksmith in Dunmore Station who understands iron work. He will know how. Follow the Tote Road north from the station for 7 miles. You will come to a valley with a creek running through it. There is a settlement there called Hollow Creek. It does not appear on the county survey by the people's own choice, for reasons of their own that are not mine to explain. Tell them Millicent sent you. They are good people. They will understand. A printing press is not a luxury. It is the way that people who have no other recourse get to speak in a register that someone else has to reckon with. I hope you use it well. Millicent Vore, October 14, 1891. Opal read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the dirt floor of the outbuilding, with her back against the press frame, and looked at the ceiling, where cold light came through a gap in the chinking. She thought about Jerome Mack and his open ledger. She thought about Vincent Mack and his composing stone. She thought about a woman named Millicent Vore who had kept a press running alone in the bush for 9 years after her husband died, printing records for people nobody else was printing records for, and who had saved every cent she didn't need and sealed it in oilcloth under a false panel for whoever came next, on the theory that whoever came next down a line that everyone said ran to nothing would be exactly the kind of person who needed a beginning and would know what to do with one. The press was cold iron against her spine. The composing stick was in her coat pocket. The dog came and lay down against her knee without being invited. She had arrived at a ruin, and the ruin contained exactly what she knew how to use. Vincent had told her once, when she asked why he kept working long past when he could have retired. A trade doesn't become useless just because the hand that built it is gone. It waits. She went back to Dunmore Station the following week. She did not go near the former print shop. The buyer had already changed the sign. She went to the smithy. Cormac Flett was at the forge, working a bar of flat iron with unhurried precision. He looked up when she came in. She explained what she had found. She told him the press was a Chandler and Price Platen tabletop model and that the composition rollers needed recasting. She gave him the measurements from memory. He set down his hammer and wrote them in a small notebook without asking how she knew them. Millicent Vor's press, he said, not a question. You knew her. Knew of her. She printed the flood record in '88. My cousin's property is up that road. She sent word to the county when nobody else would. He regarded Opal with steady, unhurried interest. You know how to run one of those things? I have run a press since I was 13, she said. He looked back at his notebook. Rollers'll take me a week. Come back Thursday, he added, without particular ceremony. Soak the ink disc in warm linseed for 2 full days before you work the lever. Don't force the mechanism cold. I know, she said. He almost smiled. I suppose you do. She walked back along the spur that afternoon with her supplies. Linseed oil, a tin of stove black, muslin, flour, dried beans, salt pork, lamp oil. Enough to last a careful winter. The dog met her at the junction and fell in beside her without comment, as though the return trip were simply part of its regular circuit. 2 weeks after she had first arrived, with the press cleaned and the station house made weather-tight, the roof patched, the chinking replaced with creek clay and sawdust mixed in the proportion Cormac Flett had described. She followed Millicent's directions north. The tote road was barely visible, grown over with alder and the bleached stalks of last summer's fireweed. But it was there under her boots if she paid attention, the slight compression of the ground that decades of cartwheels leave behind. She walked 7 miles into the Shield country, while bare birches stood white against a pewter sky, and the creek ran loud and cold to her left. The valley, when she came into it, was not what she had expected. She had braced for hardship, another collection of ruins. Instead, she found 14 solid houses of squared timber and fieldstone, each with a root cellar mounded against the frost, a woodpile properly stacked under a lean-to, a kitchen garden cut back for winter but clearly tended, smoke from several chimneys, the sound of a crosscut saw, 2 people working in easy rhythm. They saw her before she reached the first house. A man came out and stood watching. 2 others emerged from a woodshed. Their faces were not hostile, but held in a particular careful way she recognized. The look of people who have learned that being found is not always a safe thing. A woman came from the largest house and crossed the yard with the purposeful walk of someone accustomed to being the first to speak. She was perhaps 60, strongly built, with the settled bearing of a person who had made a great many hard decisions and stopped revisiting them. Her name, Opal would come to learn, was Dorinda Chalk. This road isn't on the county survey, Dorinda said. How did you find it? Opal did not look away. She said her name, said she had taken the old Pennock station house, said she had been cleaning the presence in the outbuilding when she found a letter behind the false bottom of the type drawer. Millicent Vor wrote it, she said. She told me to say she sent me. Something moved through Dorinda Chalk's face, not warmth, not yet, but a kind of recognition that carried old grief inside it, the way a river carries cold. She looked at Opal for a long, steady moment. Come in then, she said at last. You'll have tea. Over the course of that afternoon, Dorinda told her the community's history in the unhurried way of someone who has carried a story a long time and knows exactly how much of it needs telling. Their families had held timber licenses in this valley under Crown grant since the 1850s. A Montreal syndicate had worked the county surveyor in 1868, had the boundaries redrawn to invalidate the licenses, and had walked away with the rights to the timber. The families had fought through the courts for 6 years, spending everything they had. They had lost. Rather than scatter, 43 people had packed what they owned and walked north off the survey grid into a valley their grandparents had known as a summer camp. That had been 26 years ago. They had built homes, kept cattle, planted orchards, schooled their children with books carried in on their backs. They had chosen, deliberately and collectively, to disappear from the paperwork that had once been used to destroy them. It had been the right choice. It had also meant an isolation that wore on people in ways that did not always show on the surface. Over that winter and into the spring, Opal became something neither world had quite had before. She used Millicent's fund to purchase paper, type, and ink from a foundryman in Peterborough. She brought to Hollow Creek what it could not easily get on its own: salt, sugar, lamp oil, steel for the forge. And Cormac Flett hauled it to the Spur junction without asking questions that were not his business. What she printed: letters to county officials written in the careful language of people who understood law and had learned to use it precisely. Notices posted discreetly in Dunmore Station. A small plain news sheet, no masthead, no registered title, circulated among the 14 houses, carrying market prices, weather records, and the small news of families keeping their lives intact in the Shield country. She did not make speeches about any of this. She set the type, ran the press, and delivered the papers. In return, the people of Hollow Creek taught her what a printshop girl had never had reason to learn: how to read the ice on the creek before trusting it with her weight, which roots could carry a winter larder through to March, how to run a sapline properly so the tree was not wounded, how to read the sky to the north when the barometer was dropping and the wind was shifting east. Dorinda Chalk watched all of this with the careful attention of a woman who had learned not to trust quickly, but had not given up on the practice of trusting. One evening in January, she stood in the doorway of the station house while Opal fed sheets through the press by the light of a coal oil lamp, the smell of fresh ink warm in the cold air, the dog asleep on the floor beside the stove. Millicent would be pleased, Dorinda said quietly. She did not say it more than once. She did not need to. Spring came late to the Shield country that year. The snow held in the spruce hollows until the middle of May, and the creek ran high and fast with the melt long after the birches had leafed out. But it came, as it always does, carrying the smell of last year's leaves releasing themselves back into the ground. On an evening in late May, with the station house door open to the first real warmth and the creek audible and close, Opal sat at the table she had built from planks off the old signal shed. The press stood covered in its outbuilding. The coal oil lamp burned low on the table. The dog was asleep against the doorframe, one ear up, one ear folded, keeping its own counsel about whatever dogs consider in the evening. In front of her, two objects. The composing stick. Vincent Mack had placed it across the composing stone the day she set her first clean full-page proof without a single error, and gone back to feeding the press without ceremony, and that small, unceremonious moment had been the most important of her working life. He had spent 8 years teaching her that how a thing is set determines how it is read. That precision in the arrangement of small things is not pedantry but care. That a word given the wrong weight changes meaning entirely. He had taught her to give words their proper form, and then he had died mid-line and left her to use what he had given her. And Millicent's letter, folded and refolded until the paper had gone soft at every crease. A woman who had kept a press running alone in the bush for 9 years, for families who had no other way of being heard, who had lived simply, saved carefully, and sealed $340 in oilcloth under a poplar panel on the theory that whoever came next down a rail line that everyone agreed ran to nothing would be exactly the kind of person who needed a beginning and would know what to do with one. Opal thought about Jerome Mack, not with bitterness. Bitterness required a kind of ongoing attention she could not afford, and besides, Jerome Mack had already received the only judgment that would ever matter to him. He had sold a print shop and called it a good week's work. He had handed her $73 and considered the account closed. He had looked at 8 years of her life and seen a minor administrative inconvenience. Resolved. He had not thought to ask what she could do. He had only calculated what she had cost. The Pennock Spur ran to nothing. Everyone in Haliburton County who thought about it at all knew that. A lumber line whose mill was 12 years dead, rails rusting under birch root, a station house with a sagging corner, and an outbuilding full of old equipment under a faded tarp. There was no reason for a person with options to walk down it. She had walked down it because a man she respected had told her long ago that a tool doesn't become useless just because the hand that last held it is gone. She had walked down it because her own hands had recognized the press for what it was before her mind had made any decision at all. And she had walked down it because a woman she would never meet had understood something true about the world, and had taken considerable pains to leave that understanding in a place where the right person might find it. She picked up the composing stick and held its weight. For a moment the brass warm from her hands, the steel smooth at the groove where two sets of fingers had worn it down over the years. First his, then hers. She set it down beside Millicent's letter. Outside, the creek ran clear and certain through the valley. Up the tote road, 14 houses were dark and warm, and full of people who had built their world in a place that appeared on no county map, and who were slowly, carefully, learning to let someone carry their words to the places that needed to hear them. She had not planned any of this. She had simply walked down the track that everyone else had written off, with bread and cheese in her bag and a composing stick in her pocket, and paid attention to what she found at the end of it. We hope this story found you tonight where you needed it most. If it moved you, please share it with someone who might be glad of it. Before we go, we want to leave you with this. In your own life, what's the abandoned line you've been told leads nowhere? And what do you think might be waiting at the end of it? For someone willing to walk. We'll be back soon. Take good care of yourselves out there.